Hi, this is Daniel Korobkin speaking to you from the webyeshiva.org Facebook page. We are on Facebook Live. We gather here on Monday mornings to study Moreh Nevukhim, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. We've been doing this for a couple of years already, and we are currently now still in the first section, chapter 47. Using the Shlomo Pines edition, we are on page 104. Just to get our bearings as to where we are, we had been discussing some of the anthropomorphic descriptions of God and how the Rambam is emphatic in underscoring how all of the terminology that we find in Tanakh that describes God anthropomorphically has to be taken metaphorically because God is the ultimate unitary and non-corporeal being. Okay, so we are continuing in chapter 47 with a discussion of any time we find in Tanakh that God is referred to as having senses, like sight or hearing or smelling and so forth. And one of the interesting things that we're going to make note of today is that, first of all, there are only, the human being has five senses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. And we're going to make note that out of those five senses, the Tanakh only ascribes to God 3 out of those 5. And the 3 out of those 5 that are ascribed to God are seeing, hearing, and smelling. But tasting and touching are never ascribed to God according to the Rambam. The second thing that we're going to discover in today's short chapter is that in Aristotelian philosophy, there are both internal and external senses. The external senses are the things that allow us to draw things from the outside world into our mind. And those are the 5 senses that we're used to discussing. But there are intellectual senses as well that the Rambam's going to discuss. And just as there are only a subset of the external senses that are ascribed to God in Tanakh, so too, when it comes to the internal senses, there are only certain kinds of internal senses or faculties that are ascribed to God, and not certain other ones that are not befitting to describe of God. So before we go any further, let me just remind you that in our Facebook group, Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, we regularly distribute a handout for most of our classes. Today is no exception. And so if you open up a new tab on your browser and you open up the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, you'll be able to download the PDF for today, which is called External and Internal Senses, Positive and Negative. Okay, so let's get into the text right now. And he writes as follows: "We have mentioned several times that the books of the prophets do not figuratively ascribe to God anything that the multitude imagine to be a deficiency, or that one cannot represent to oneself as belonging to him, may he be exalted, even if these things have the same status as those that are figuratively ascribed to him." And what essentially the Rambam has just gotten through saying is that never will the Tanakh in any way diminish our image of God in our mind. Whenever the prophets use a metaphor, using human terms to describe God, they only use those terms that will elevate or give more substance or reality to God in our minds. But if they in any way detract from our image of God as being the ultimate exalted being, the prophets will refrain from using that kind of metaphor. For the things that are predicated of him suggest to the estimate of faculty certain perfections, or can be imagined to be perfections with respect to him. So we had seen this was way back in chapters 26 and chapters 46, that the Rambam had created a contrast between when a prophet talks about God eating, which the prophet never does, whereas the prophets do tend to describe God as a moving God, and that God can come forth and God can move from one place to another. Now, in reality, the faculties that human beings possess, both to move and to ingest food, are all faculties that we were endowed with by our Creator to enable us to survive, to enable us to thrive. So therefore, a person has the ability to eat so that they can continually power the engine that allows them to have energy. But a person moves also also to be able to obtain that which the person needs if it's far away, or to run away from something that is dangerous to that individual. And so the power of locomotion is also a very mortal faculty. What's the difference between the two? Why is it that the prophet has no problem describing God metaphorically as a moving God, where the prophet will never describe God as an eating God? And the difference is that the faculty of eating is exclusively descriptive of a being that is dependent upon food. Okay? And so therefore it is much more of a derogatory type of metaphor, because if we were to describe God as eating, it would imply that God is deficient in some way and needs to energize himself through eating. But to say that God is moving, there are many times that human beings move, not because they need to satisfy their needs with something that is external to them, but sometimes I might be impelled to move in order to help somebody else, or in order to do something kind for something that's outside of my environment that has nothing to do with me. And therefore it is not as much of a detraction from God to describe God metaphorically as moving. And that's the difference that the Rambam had already established in two prior chapters. We did this in chapter 46, but also all the way back in chapter 26. And accordingly, in view of this having been established, it behooves us now to explain why hearing, sight, and the sense of smell are figuratively ascribed to him, may he be exalted, whereas the sense of taste and that of touch are not. And that's what I had opened up with. So the status of all five senses with regard to the fact that he may be exalted as high above them is one and the same. In other words, God does not possess any senses because God is completely unitary. God does not have any sensory perception. God is pure intellect in the view of the Rambam. And because what is a sense? A sense enables a being to receive information from the outside and bring it into their mind. Because God is not outside or inside, there's no outside or inside in reference to God. God does not need senses to bring information to him. And all the senses are a deficiency from the standpoint of apprehension. In other words, my mind is in some way limited because it relies on my senses to bring me information from the outside, and let's say through sight. Images enter into through my eyes, and that is how those images enter into my mind. So that's a limitation on the human being, that the human being does not have any other interaction with that which is outside of him than through his eyes. Okay? This is so even with regard to a being that only apprehends by means of the senses, for the latter are passive, receptive of impressions, intermittent and subject to pain, as are all the other organs. Okay? So we passively receive images, and it is only our mind that acts upon those images and processes those images and makes conclusions out of those images. So the senses are passive, receptive of impressions, intermittent, sometimes I can see, sometimes I cannot see, and subject to pain. Sometimes the eye can be injured and the senses can be injured if something is too bright and so forth. The meaning of our saying that he be exalted has sight is that he apprehends the visible things, and that of our saying that he has hearing is that he apprehends the audible things. God does not have senses. He has neither eyes nor ears that passively receive, but all the prophets mean to say when it says that God sees and hears is that God is aware of all that is taking place on a physical plane, such that just as we see and our sight brings us information, so too God possesses that same kind of information. He could similarly have had the sense of taste and that of touch predicated of him, and that could have been interpreted as meaning that he apprehends the things that are objects of the sense of taste and touch. So by the same token, argues the Rambam, if we're going to metaphorically ascribe sight and hearing to God, why not ascribe taste and touch? For the status of the apprehension of all of them is one and the same. They're all metaphorical. If, however, the apprehension characteristic of one of the senses is denied him, it would necessarily follow that the apprehensions characteristic of all of them, I mean all of the five senses, should be denied him. Meaning that it's all or nothing. If you're going to extend yourself to the metaphor that God has senses, so then you should say that God has all five senses. And if you're going to deny that God has the capacity for sensing one of the five senses, then you should deny that he has none of the senses. If, however, his having an apprehension characteristic of one of them, I mean an apprehension of what one of these senses apprehends, should be affirmed of him, it would necessarily follow that he apprehends all the things apprehensible by the five senses. So the fact that the Tanakh does not ascribe touch or taste to God does not imply that God is incapable of attaining knowledge that we attain through touch, or attaining knowledge of something that we attain through taste. Because once we've gone out on a limb and ascribed to God sensory perception, God is capable of acquiring knowledge of everything, including those things which we know of through touch and through taste. So we find that our books say, in many ways, that the Lord saw, and the Lord heard, and the Lord smelled, but they do not say, and the Lord tasted, nor do they say, and the Lord touched. So this is part of the dilemma. If God is capable of all sensory perception using this metaphor, then why don't we find tasted and touched? So here's the cause, he says. The cause of this is to be found in the fact that it is firmly established in everyone's imagination that God does not encounter bodies in the way one body encounters another, for people do not even see him. We're going to change the translation that we have in front of us. So the first point that the Rambam is going to approach is God's sense of touch. If we were to ascribe God as having a sense of touch, that would immediately conjure in our minds that God is a body, that God is physical in some way, that he can physically come in contact with physical things. So that already is problematic. It's not problematic to say that God can see, because human beings can see things that are far away from them, and they can hear things that are far away from them. But once you say that someone is touching something, it means that they are in direct physical contact. And that's an anthropomorphism which is too corporeal, too embedded in the physical, in order for us to be able to properly ascribe that to God. We can't even see God. So God does not encounter items of the physical world in the same thing that you and I do. Now, these two senses, I mean the sense of taste and the sense of touch, do not apprehend the things sensed by them before they are in contact with them. And the same thing is true with the sense of taste. You can only taste something if you're in direct physical contact between your tongue and the object that you are tasting. So this already is overly physical and overly conjuring the image of God being a body, and that's unacceptable. On the other hand, the sense of sight, that of hearing, and that of smell can apprehend from a distance the qualities sensed by them, as well as the bodies that are the bearers of those qualities. It is, therefore, according to the imagination of the multitude, permitted to ascribe them to God. Okay, so reason number one, why we differentiate between the three senses that God does possess, and we don't ascribe the other two senses of touch and taste to God, is because the senses of touch and taste require a direct physical contact between the toucher and the touchy, or the taster and the tastee. So that's the first thing. That's already too physically, that conjures too much of a physical image of God. So that's reason number one. And then he says another reason. In addition, the purpose and the intent in figuratively ascribing to him these senses are to indicate that he apprehends our actions. Now the sense of hearing and that of sight suffice for this. I mean hereby that by means of them, everything that someone other than oneself does or says can be apprehended. And so the Rambam now says, whenever we find the prophets describing God as having senses, it is primarily for the purpose of noting how God interacts with humanity, with the phenomenon of the human being. Okay? And if we need to describe God as interacting in some way with humanity or the human being, it will suffice to limit God to two senses, seeing and hearing, because you don't need to taste a person to interact with them and to be aware of their lives. You don't need to touch a person to interact with them and to be aware of their lives. Just look at the pandemic. We've learned how to interact and to understand people and to share with them our lives and understand their lives without touching them. So those two senses are completely unnecessary to ascribe to God if the whole objective is to ascribe to God an interaction with our lives and a perception and a knowledge of what we are doing in our lives. And thus the sages have said, when setting forth their admonitions by way of reproof and warning, this is from the second chapter of Pirkei Avot, and this is in source number 4, Histakel bishlosha devarim, the Mishnah says in the name of Rebbe, look at three things, v'i'ata ba lidei avera, and you will never come to sin. Da malamayla mimcha, know what is above you. The three things that are above you are ayin ro'eh, a seeing eye, ozen shoma'at, a hearing ear, and then the third thing has nothing to do with sensory perception, but rather v'chol ma'asecha b'sefer nichtavim, that everything that you do in life is recorded in a book in some way. But the point is that the sensory ascriptions that are mentioned in the Mishnah are seeing and hearing. And as we've talked about before, the difference between God seeing and God hearing is that we describe God as seeing when we talk about things that are overt actions that are visible to the world. When does God hear? God hears when he comprehends that which is not visible to the outside world, such as emotions, such as pain that an individual is feeling, or such as joy that an individual is feeling, or such as malicious intent or good intents of the heart. Those are things that God hears in the sense that they are not visible, but they are audible to a person who is well attuned to the human condition. So therefore, seeing and hearing, things that you do from afar, are the only things that are necessary to describe how God interacts with us. So the second answer of the Rambam as to why the sense of taste and the sense of touch are not ascribed to God is because it's simply not necessary. Since using metaphors, anthropomorphic metaphors, is a concession to the limitations of the human mind, we wish to restrict the types of metaphors that we ascribe to God as much as possible. And therefore, if we can get away with just using 2 metaphors instead of 5 metaphors of the 5 senses, that's what we would prefer to do. Now, here's the thing. There's one sense which the Rambam seems now to have overlooked. We do know that the sense of smell is ascribed to God in Tanakh. For example, Vayarach Hashem et reach hanichoach, that in Genesis chapter 8, after Noah and his family come off the ark, Noah offers sacrifices to God, and it says that God smelled the savory fragrance. And that is what caused him to say with conviction that he will never bring another flood upon humanity. So, on the one hand, the Rambam had, his first reason was to delineate between 3 senses versus 2 senses, is that the sense of sight, hearing, and smell can be done from a distance, whereas the senses of touch and taste, you have to be in physical contact, and that's not ascribable to God. Over here, he says, the senses of sight and hearing are sufficient to ascribe to God, and you don't need the 3 other senses. What about the sense of smell that is found in Tanakh? So the Ephodi asks this question, and he says that, yes, in general, the vast majority of metaphors that ascribe sensory perception to God are seeing and hearing. You find smelling very rarely, and only then in context with the korbanot, with the sacrificial offerings. Because this is a very important kind of worship of God, that God deems in the entire book of Leviticus and elsewhere to be a very important way of serving him. And it describes God as imbibing or smelling the fragrance of the sacrifices. That is the reason why sometimes, on rare occasion, the prophet will ascribe smell to God, because it is a way of demonstrating that God is appreciative of man's worship of him. But again, that's a special case, and it also is descriptive of God's awareness of what man is doing, especially in the service of God, and that's why the sense of smell will also be ascribed to him. So just to review our two reasons why only sight and hearing and smelling are ascribed to God and not touch and taste. Our reason number one is that the first three senses are at a distance. Taste and touch must be done with physical contact. That's not appropriate to ascribe to God. And reason number two, since we wish to limit as much as possible metaphors of sensory perception to God, we will only use sight and hearing as the primary metaphors, and only on very rare occasion will we use the sense of smell. But the sense of touch and taste do not in any way help us appreciate the fact that God is an interactive God, aware of what we are doing in this world. Now, let's finish the chapter. Now, when you investigate the true reality, you shall see that the status of all the senses is that of any one of them, and that from the same standpoint from which it is negated that he has apprehensions involving touch and taste, it should also be negated that he has sight, hearing, and the sense of smell. For all of them are apprehensions of a corporeal nature, affections, and changeable states, meaning in that the person who is having these sensory perceptions is being affected and is being altered or changed as a result of images or sounds or tastes or smells coming to him. God is unchangeable. God is non-corporeal. So really none of the senses, including sight and hearing, are really properly ascribable to him. However, with regard to some of them, it is apparent that they are deficiencies, whereas other are deemed to be perfections. And his point being, just like we made the distinction in chapter 26 between God eating and God moving, it's one thing to say that God can see and hear. That does not automatically create an association in the mind of deficiency, just because I say that someone can see or hear. Because as we mentioned, when it comes to moving, sometimes I'm granted the ability to see so that I can attain that which I need, but there are also sometimes that I can see so that I can be able to help another person. And therefore, God is ascribed with sight and hearing, not so much that he can help himself, but rather that he can have a relationship with the human being for the benefit of the human being. And now the Rambam gets into a slightly different discussion as far as the internal senses. Just as it is manifest that to imagine is a deficiency, whereas it is not manifest that to reflect and to, he calls it gradually to understand, but I would say to meditate is likewise a deficiency. Okay, here the Rambam is talking about one's the divisions of the mental faculties that are what we would call internal senses or internal sensory perception. We explained before that the external senses bring information from the outside world into the mind. But in philosophy, especially in Aristotelian philosophy, the mind then takes that information and processes it in different ways. There is the faculty of memory, which conjures up images that I'm not presently sensing, but which I've sensed in the past. There's the imagination faculty, which takes from the memory different images and sounds that I have experienced in the past and creates artificial images in my mind. And then there's the faculty of rumination or meditation that allows a person using his intellect to process different ideas and to come up with abstract thoughts about different concepts which are not necessarily based upon sensory perception. And the whole debate even among the Renaissance philosophers as to whether all knowledge is a priori or a posteriori. Do we attain knowledge through our senses? Are we empiricists only gaining our knowledge from the outside? Or is it like Descartes, and before him Aristotle and Aquinas and so forth, believed that we attain knowledge many times from the processes of our minds that are independent of the things that we take from the images that we take from the outside. So the Rambam is of the opinion, and we're going to elaborate on this point as we get more into the philosophical concepts within Moreh Nevukhim, that it is possible for that the human mind is comprised of many, many different faculties. Just like we have external senses, we have internal senses. And the internal sense of imagination, where I conjure false images, is actually descriptive of something deficient within the human being. Whereas to say that someone is thinking, someone is ruminating, someone is meditating, so those are not automatically associated with something negative or something derogatory, whereas imagination is. Now, you're probably hearing me say those words and you're saying to yourself, what is derogatory about the faculty of imagination? People use their imagination all the time to conjure up very positive images which help them associate with reality, and which help them dream, and which help them to create, and which help them become great artists and poets and masters of expression and so forth, as we can go on ad infinitum. And yet it is important for you to know that in the Rambam's world, the imagination faculty is considered something negative because it conjures up false images that are not actually within the realm of reality. So that's why I can imagine a fire-breathing dragon, even though fire-breathing dragons don't exist, because in my memory, I have thoughts of reptiles, and I can make them larger than life. I have thoughts of reptiles that can grow wings because I know what birds' wings like, and then I can attach those birds' wings and make them leathery and attach them to reptiles in my mind. I know what it means to have bolts of fire or a flamethrower, and I can attach that to the mouth of the dragon and conjure a false image that doesn't exist of something in my imagination faculty. Right? So that's the idea that the Rambam is trying to describe. However, and this is the point, I want you to just bear with me for just a moment and accept it as given that for the Rambam, the imagination faculty is something that is descriptive of a deficiency within the human mind and not of something that is optimal. Because it would be optimal for a person to gain all of their ideas without the use of their imagination faculty, but rather with the use of their intellect, their pure intellect, to process ideas without conjuring up false images. And I'll get to that in just a minute. But let's finish up the language. And he says, therefore, the word rayon, fancy, or to come up with a false imaginative idea, which word means imagination, which in Hebrew is dimyon, is not figuratively ascribed to him, whereas thought, machshava, and comprehension, tivuna, which words mean reflection and understanding, are figuratively ascribed to him. Thus it is said that, and then the Rambam gives sources both in Jeremiah chapter 49, Lachein shimu atzat Hashem, asher chashav el yoshvei Timan, that God thinks about the inhabitants of Yemen. And with his comprehension, he stretched out the heavens, from Jeremiah chapter 10, utvunat, that oseh eretz bekocho mechin tevel bechochmato, that God prepares the entire world with his wisdom, uvitvunato natashmaim, and with his discernment or understanding, his tivuna, God spreads out the heavens. Accordingly, the position with regard to the internal apprehensions is similar to that obtaining with regard to the external sensory apprehensions, meaning just like we ascribe only limited sensory perception to God from the external senses, we also only ascribe internal mental faculties to God, those things which are not immediately associated with deficiency. Some of the former as well as the latter are figuratively ascribed to him, while others are not. All this is according to the language of the sons of man, Dibra Torah Kilshon B'nei Adam, that the Torah speaks using human language, so that anthropomorphic language, so that we can better understand God, but at the same time will not be so anthropomorphic so as to conjure an image of deficiency within God. For they predicate of God what they deem to be a perfection in respect to him, and do not predicate of him that which is manifestly a deficiency. When, however, the true reality is investigated, it will be found, as shall be demonstrated, that he has no essential attributes, neither external nor internal, existing in true reality, such as would be superadded to his essence, because God is the ultimate unity, without anything added to that unity, without any separate components of God having to do with different types of mental faculties or external senses. Now, we're going to just go a couple of minutes longer today. I wanted to demonstrate to you how in Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy, the idea of the imagination as a tool within the mind to conjure up artificial images is portrayed with a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it could be a very useful tool to imagine certain images to help a person gain a better clarity of what truly is. But it's almost like training wheels on a bicycle. It's something that you can use when you're initially starting off your career as a true intellectual being, but you eventually have to divest yourself of with the acknowledgement that the images that you conjure are not real and are a distortion of the reality. Now, as this pertains to spiritual matters, as to religious matters, think to yourself as follows. Is it better to imagine God as an old man with a long flowing white beard and white robe sitting on a chair in heaven? Or is it better not to conjure that image of God at all? Well, understand that there are some mifarshei machshava, some Jewish thinkers who believe that to portray God as the old man in the sky is a form of idolatry, right? Because you're not allowed to ascribe any image to God. And yet, by the same token, it can be helpful to an individual who wishes to create an image of a benevolent Father in heaven who is an almighty being, as being that old man with the long flowing white beard and the white robe. But the acknowledgement is, but it's a distortion. It's not real, because God ein lo demut haguf ein no guf. God has no corporeal form whatsoever. So that's an example where theologically, even using the faculty of my imagination to imagine things related to God, especially in imaginative images form, is actually something negative, but may be necessary as a stepping stone to getting towards the true understanding of things as they really are. So I'm just quoting to you from a book by Professor Aaron Hughes. This is a relatively recently published book called The Texture of the Divine, Imagination in Medieval Islamic and Jewish Thought, on page 82 of that work. And we will come back to this idea of the different attitudes towards imagination. That on the one hand, it can be a positive if it acts as a stepping stone to help you bridge the gap between your corporeal thoughts and the true essence of intellectual reality. But at the same time, it's something that you should try to get past to when you reach intellectual perfection. And he writes as follows, Professor Hughes writes as follows: vision, the strongest of our senses, is central to our engagement with and in the world. Without vision, we encounter the world in only two dimensions, unable to process the fullness of the world in all of its richness and diversity. Since the currency of the imagination is images, its main activity is often associated with a type of visualization. This vision, however, is not external and directed toward what physically exists before us. Rather, it is internal, bringing into existence that which is no longer present. For this reason, the medieval thinkers often referred to the imagination as the inner eye. The imagination is thus a creative faculty responsible for the formation of images of things or concepts that the senses have apprehended, but that are now no longer visible. Now, this presencing of the absent is both the blessing and the curse of the imagination in the history of Western philosophy. Because of its ability to make the absent present, many philosophers in both the ancient and medieval worlds regarded this faculty as unreliable and unpredictable, responsible for the formation of inauthentic expressions. For example, the image of a beautiful object is not the same thing as the object itself. which in turn is but a pale imitation of a formal and incorporeal beauty, using Platonic ideas. Images, then, are twice removed from the really real. For reasons such as this, philosophers distrusted the productive or mimetic aspect of the imagination. In a system that gives priority to intellection, production must always be derivative. To imagine something, then, is secondary or even tertiary and inferior to our ability to encounter it physically and in such a manner that we can study, analyze, and know it. So this is really an affirmation of what the Rambam means when he says that we don't ascribe imagination to God. The verb dimyon, which is what the Rambam was referring to, is not something that we will, or rayon, is not something that we will ever find ascribed to God in Tanakh. Now, just to conclude, the question that might be raised is that the verb dimyon is ascribed to God in a couple of places in Tanakh, and I have that on the sheet over here. This question is asked by the Ephodi and by the Abarbanel, the commentaries. The one that you may be familiar with is at the end of the book of Numbers, V'haya ka'asher dimiti la'asot lahem e'eseh lachem. That if you do not drive out the indigenous inhabitants of Canaan when you come to inherit the land, then that which I had thought to do to them, I will instead do to you. It's God threatening the Jewish people that you must do your job and drive out the idolatrous nations, because if you don't, that which I had thought to do to them, I will do to you, or that which I had imagined to do to them, I will do to you. There's also another reference to it in the book of Isaiah, using the very same verb of domeh. And this creates a bit of a problem to the Rambam's thesis. Both the Ephodi and the Abarbanel answer this question, each one in a different way. But as a general rule, you will not find the imagination faculty ascribed to God, is the Rambam's point, because imagination represents a deficiency within the human condition. We're way over time, so I apologize for doing that, and I wish you a wonderful day and a wonderful week. We will continue Be'ezrat Hashem, chapter 48, next week.